The sharp crack of the rifle volley echoed across the manicured grass of the veterans' cemetery, a sound that made the birds fall silent. But in the stillness that followed, another sound intruded, a clumsy fumbling of fabric, a hissed whisper, "Get it right, airman!" The young honor guard team was struggling with the flag, their movements clumsy, their crisp dress blues, a stark contrast to their graceless handling of the sacred cloth. An old man stood apart from the main group of mourners, his back straight despite the slight tremor in his hands. He watched the disastrous 13 folds, his jaw tight. "Sir," a young staff sergeant said, his voice dripping with condescending pity, "please step back. We have this under control." But he didn't, and the old man knew it. If you believe honor is earned, not given, what type respect in the comments. His name was Arthur Jenkins, and he was 78 years old. The world saw a man whose shoulders were stooped by the gravity of years, whose hands were a roadmap of liver spots and raised veins. His suit, a dark gray wool, was impeccably clean but hopelessly out of style, the fabric worn thin at the elbows and collar. He walked with a careful, measured gait, a consequence of a left knee that had started protesting the cold winters about a decade ago. Every morning he followed the same routine: rise before the sun, black coffee, a quiet hour on the porch watching the neighborhood wake up. He lived in a small, tidy bungalow he'd bought with his wife, Eleanor, 40 years ago. Now only her pictures on the mantelpiece kept him company. To any observer, he was just another retired widower, living out his quiet final chapter. But in the right pocket of his trousers, his fingers were curled around a small, heavy disk of metal. It was a challenge coin, its edges worn smooth from decades of touch. On one side was the Air Force crest, on the other an eagle clutching a key, the insignia of a unit that officially didn't exist. The weight of it in his hand was a constant, tangible link to a life no one in his quiet suburban world knew he had lived. It was a reminder of oaths sworn, of promises kept, and of the men he had served alongside. One of those men, Chief Master Sergeant Robert Henderson, was in the casket just a few yards away. Robbie had been his protege, a young, fire-breathing buck sergeant whom Arthur had molded into one of the finest leaders the Air Force had ever seen. The tremor in Arthur's hands wasn't from age or frailty. It was from a grief so profound it felt like a physical vibration, a sorrow that was now being compounded by the insult of this sloppy, dishonorable display. He had seen hundreds of flags folded, had folded dozens himself in jungle clearings and on windswept desert tarmacs, each fold a precise, meaningful act. What he was witnessing now was a betrayal of that meaning. But what none of them knew, not the grieving widow, not the flustered funeral director, not even the young staff sergeant whose condescension was a mask for his own panic, was that in exactly 7 minutes an old man's quiet grief would erupt into a display of discipline and honor that would shatter the assumptions of everyone present. The cemetery was a place of profound order. Rows of identical white headstones stood at perfect attention, a silent, disciplined legion. The grass was a deep, impossible green cut to a uniform length. A gentle breeze whispered through the oak trees that bordered the grounds, carrying the scent of cut grass and distant rain. It was a place designed for quiet dignity, for somber reflection. Today, that dignity felt fragile. The funeral of Chief Henderson had drawn a respectable crowd. Family, of course, occupied the front rows of folding chairs set up under a green canopy. Behind them stood dozens of active-duty airmen from the nearby base. their uniforms a sea of blue. Sprinkled throughout were men like Arthur, older veterans in suits and VFW caps, their faces etched with the shared language of service and loss. The honor guard detail consisted of 6 young airmen, all impossibly young, their faces smooth and earnest. Their leader was Staff Sergeant Evans, a man in his mid-20s with a ramrod posture and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite. He was a picture of military bearing, but a fine sheen of sweat on his brow betrayed his stress. This was an important funeral. A chief master sergeant was just one step below the general, and a lot of important eyes were on them. Evans had drilled his team for weeks, demanding a perfection that bordered on obsession. In the sterile, controlled environment of the base drill pad, they had been flawless. Out here, with the wind, the raw emotion, and the weight of a real casket, things were different. The air itself felt charged with expectation. The widow, Sarah Henderson, a woman of immense grace, clutched a folded tissue in her hand, her eyes fixed on the flag draping her husband's coffin. She deserved perfection. Robbie deserved perfection. The ceremony had proceeded with solemn precision up to this point. The chaplain's words, the playing of taps that sent a shiver down every spine, the thunderous retort of the 7 rifles. Now came the final, most intimate ritual, the folding of the flag that had been his final blanket. It was the moment the nation symbolically took its hero into its arms one last time. What the young staff sergeant didn't realize was that someone was already watching him from the back of the crowd, someone who recognized the name Henderson on the program and had driven 3 hours on the off chance he might see a familiar face, someone who recognized Arthur Jenkins from a photograph that had hung on a wall in the Pentagon for 20 years. The first sign of trouble was subtle. As 2 airmen lifted the flag from the casket, their movements were not quite synchronized. One corner dipped precariously close to the ground, an almost unforgivable sin. Staff Sergeant Evans shot a venomous glare at the offender, a young airman named Garcia, whose face was already pale with nerves. They stretched the flag taut, holding it waist-high, a vast rectangle of red, white, and blue snapping in the breeze. The folding began. The first fold, lengthwise, was sloppy. A wrinkle, a clear pucker in the fabric marred the clean line. Evans' jaw tightened. The second fold was better, but the tension was already broken. The 2 airmen at the folding end began the triangular folds, meant to be a swift, precise sequence. Instead, their hands seemed to work against each other. One pulled too tight, the other not tight enough. The emerging triangle was loose, misshapen. A murmur, soft as rustling leaves, went through the crowd. It was a sound of discomfort, of shared embarrassment. Arthur felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He didn't move. He just watched, his gaze fixed on the flag. He saw not just a botched ceremony, but a failure of leadership, a breakdown in the chain of respect that was supposed to bind to them all. Evans, seeing the disaster unfolding, made a critical error. He stepped in. Breaking the solemn stillness of the formation, he moved to the flag and tried to physically guide the hands of his airmen, hissing instructions through clenched teeth. "Tighter! Keep it tight, Garcia! Watch your corners!" His intervention only made it worse. The rhythm was gone. The sacred ritual had devolved into a clumsy public training exercise. The widow flinched, a small, almost imperceptible movement. As if she had been struck, she looked away from the flag, her eyes finding the grass at her feet. That was the moment Arthur's grief began to harden into resolve. He had remained silent out of respect for the uniform, for the process. But this was no longer a process. It was a desecration. He took one slow, deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs, and his hand tightened on the coin in his pocket. He was just an old man in a worn-out suit. But that old man was about to remind them all what honor truly looked like. They stopped. After the fifth awkward fold, with the triangle looking more like a crumpled napkin, Evans made the mortifying decision to start over. He whispered a sharp command, and the two airmen unfolded the flag, the bright colors seeming to sag in shame. They stretched it out again, the tension in their arms now painfully obvious. The silence in the cemetery was no longer respectful. It was thick and suffocating. You could hear the distant hum of traffic on the highway, the nervous cough of a man in the back row. Staff Sergeant Evans' face was flushed a deep, blotchy red. He was an NCO who prided himself on control, on discipline. He had envisioned this moment 100 times, the crisp snap of the flag, the perfect triangle, the solemn presentation to a grateful widow. He had imagined the quiet nod of approval from the base commander who was in attendance. Instead, he was facing a public humiliation, and it was happening at the funeral of a beloved chief. His ambition and his pride were curdling into a raw, defensive anger. He glared at his team, his eyes promising hours of brutal, remedial training. Airman Garcia looked as if he was about to be physically ill, his knuckles white where he gripped the cloth. The second attempt was even worse than the first. The nervousness had now become a full-blown tremor in their hands. The first lengthwise fold was acceptable, but when they began the triangular folds again, it all fell apart. The flag seemed to have a life of its own, refusing to yield to their clumsy, uncertain hands. This time, a corner of the blue field of stars actually brushed the top of the casket. A collective gasp, quiet but audible, rippled through the onlookers. The funeral director, a man in a severe black suit, took an involuntary step forward before checking himself. Evans looked wildly around, as if searching for someone to blame. His eyes swept over the crowd, over the stoic faces of the older veterans, and they landed for a moment on Arthur Jenkins. He saw a frail old man, his face a mask of disappointment. Evans didn't see respect or shared grief in that look. He saw judgment. It was the final straw for his frayed composure. He felt the need to reassert control, to prove that he was in charge, that this was his ceremony to manage, his failure to contain. The staff sergeant thought this was the end of the conversation. He was wrong. This was the beginning of the worst day of his career. Arthur closed his eyes for a single heartbeat. In that sliver of darkness, the manicured green of the cemetery dissolved, replaced by the red dust of a Da Nang airstrip. He was 25 years old again, standing over a different kind of casket. A simple aluminum box. Rain was falling, not a gentle whisper like the breeze today, but a torrential, warm monsoon that plastered his fatigues to his skin. The man in that box was named Jimmy, a kid from Ohio who'd loved baseball and the letters he got from his girl back home. Arthur had folded that flag himself. His hands hadn't shaken then, not even with the exhaustion and the grief that felt like a physical weight in his chest. He had folded it with a fierce protective precision, because that flag, that small triangle of cloth, was the last piece of America that would ever touch Jimmy. It was all they could send home to his mother. The 13 folds weren't just a procedure from a manual. They were a story, a creed. The first fold, a symbol of life. The second, a symbol of belief in eternal life. Each one had a meaning, a weight that settled into the fabric. He remembered teaching a young Robbie Henderson those same meanings, standing on a drill pad under a blistering Texas sun. "Don't just fold it, Chief," Robbie had said, his uniform soaked with sweat. "You cradle it, like it's something holy." And he was right. Arthur opened his eyes. The sight of the crumpled flag in the hands of the fumbling airmen was a physical pain. It was an insult to Robbie. It was an insult to Jimmy. It was an insult to every name etched on the wall in Washington, to every headstone in the cemetery. He looked at Sarah Henderson, her head now bowed, her shoulders shaking silently. He had promised Robbie years ago over a beer in an NCO club in Germany that he would always look out for her if anything happened to him. He was failing that promise by standing here, silent and useless. The decision wasn't made with his mind. It was a deeper, more instinctual command that rose from the core of his being, the part of him that was forever a chief master sergeant, the part that saw a failure of standards and felt the non-negotiable duty to correct it, took control. His legs, stiff from standing, began to move. He took one step, then another, walking away from the small group of veterans and toward the canopy, his gait slow and deliberate, but utterly unstoppable. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His presence alone was a disruption, a breach of the unspoken wall between the mourners and the ceremony. As he approached the green canopy, heads turned. The funeral director's eyes widened in alarm. Staff Sergeant Evans saw him coming, and his face darkened with fury. This old man was the final, intolerable element in his cascading disaster. "Sir," Evans said, his voice low and sharp, stepping forward to intercept Arthur before he could reach the casket. "You need to return to your seat. This is a restricted area." Arthur didn't even look at him. His eyes were fixed on the flag. He simply continued his slow, steady walk. Evans, incredulous, put a hand on Arthur's arm to stop him. It was a mistake. Though Arthur's frame was thin, it was wiry and dense with a lifetime of discipline. His arm didn't yield. It was like trying to stop an old oak tree from leaning in the wind. "Sir, I am giving you a direct order," Evans hissed, his professionalism completely gone, replaced by the raw anger of a young NCO whose authority was being publicly challenged. "Step back now." Arthur stopped. He turned his head slowly and looked at Staff Sergeant Evans. He didn't look at the stripes on his sleeve or the polished insignia on his hat. He looked directly into the young man's eyes. Arthur's own eyes were a pale, watery blue, but at that moment they held a depth and an authority that was staggering. They held the silent weight of jungles and deserts, of long nights on flight lines and solemn vigils in hospital rooms. For the first time, Evans felt a flicker of doubt, a cold prickle of uncertainty. Who was this old man? Arthur said nothing. He simply raised his right hand, the one that wasn't trembling with grief, and gently but firmly took hold of the flag. He didn't snatch it. He just took it, his touch so confident and proprietary that the two young airmen holding it simply let go, their own confusion overriding their orders. The trigger had been pulled. The simple act of a civilian touching the ceremonial flag was a profound breach of protocol, but the way he held it changed everything. And as he stood there in that plastic chair, waiting for someone to call his name, not a single person in that room knew that the tremor in his hands wasn't from age. It was from the same thing that had earned him the medal locked inside the glove box of his truck. 300 miles away, in a sprawling office at the Pentagon, General Marcus Miller was having a terrible day. It was a day of budget meetings, of bureaucratic wrestling, of the kind of high-level strategic arguments that felt 1,000 miles removed from the real Air Force he had joined as a young man. He'd been about to leave for another mind-numbing briefing when his aide had mentioned the funeral for Chief Henderson. Miller had frozen. Robbie Henderson. He hadn't seen him in years, but he remembered him well. More importantly, he remembered who Robbie's mentor had been, a man who had, quite literally, saved Miller's life when he was a cocky young lieutenant who thought he knew everything. On a whim, a gut feeling he couldn't explain, he had cleared his afternoon schedule. He told his aide he was feeling unwell and needed to go home. Instead, he got into his personal vehicle, a modest black SUV, not his official staff car, and started the long drive to the cemetery. He didn't wear his uniform, with its 4 gleaming stars and chest full of ribbons. He wore a simple dark suit, wanting to pay his respects quietly, anonymously. He stood at the very back of the crowd, partially shielded by a large oak tree, feeling the familiar, sad comfort of a military funeral. He saw the honor guard begin their work, and like Arthur, he felt a knot of disappointment at their clumsiness. He knew the pressure they were under, but standards were standards. Then he saw it. He saw the old man in the ill-fitting suit walk forward. He saw the arrogant young staff sergeant try to stop him, and he saw the old man take the flag. At that distance, he couldn't be sure. The face was older, lined with care, the hair a thin silver where it had once been thick and dark. But the way he stood, the set of his shoulders, the unmistakable ramrod-straight posture that defied the slump of age, it sent a jolt of electricity through him. He started moving forward, a slow, questioning pace at first. Then the old man began to fold, and General Miller stopped dead in his tracks. His breath caught in his throat. It couldn't be, but it was. With the flag now in his hands, Arthur seemed to transform. The stooped, grieving old man vanished. In his place stood a figure of immense authority and grace. He held the flag waist-high, his arms straight, his elbows locked. The fabric, which had been a crumpled mess moments before, now lay perfectly flat and taut, as if tamed by his touch alone. He didn't need a partner. His movements were an incredible display of skill and strength. With a flick of his wrists, he made the first lengthwise fold. It was perfect. Another flick, and the second fold lay precisely on top of the first, the blue field of stars facing up. The crowd, which had been murmuring in confusion, fell into a stunned silence. Staff Sergeant Evans stood frozen, his hand still half raised, his mouth slightly agape. He was witnessing something impossible. He had been taught that the fold was a 2-person job. The manual said so. The regulations said so. Yet here was this old man, doing it alone, and doing it with a precision Evans had only ever seen in grainy archival footage of the old guard at Arlington. Arthur began the 13 triangular folds. His hands were a blur of controlled, efficient motion. Each fold was identical, each tuck sharp and decisive. Snap, fold, tuck, snap, fold, tuck. The triangle grew, becoming a tight, dense wedge of blue and white stars. There was a rhythm to it, a cadence like a silent drumbeat. It was more than a procedure. It was a performance. It was a prayer made of cloth and motion. Airman Garcia watched, his eyes wide with awe. This was what it was supposed to look like. This was the dignity, the strength, the meaning he had been trying and failing to achieve. He felt a profound sense of shame, but it was quickly being replaced by an overwhelming wave of respect. Evans, however, was trapped between shock and a desperate need to reclaim his authority. His mind was racing. This was a complete breakdown of protocol. A civilian had interfered, taken control of the ceremony. Regardless of how well he was doing it, it was wrong. Protocol had to be enforced. As Arthur completed the 12th fold, Evans took a deep, steadying breath and stepped forward again, his face a mask of grim determination. Sir," he said, his voice now dangerously quiet, "I have given you an order. Hand me the flag. Now." The officer thought this was the end of the conversation. He was wrong. This was the beginning of the worst day of his career. Arthur completed the final fold. The flag was now a perfect tight triangle, a blue field of white stars. He held it in the palm of his left hand, his right hand covering it, pressing it to his heart for a moment. He turned to face the widow, Sarah Henderson, and in his eyes she saw not a stranger, but a friend, a guardian. She saw a reflection of the same honor she had loved in her husband. But just as he was about to take a step toward her, Evans moved, positioning himself directly in Arthur's path. "That's enough," Evans said, his voice hard. He reached out to take the flag. "You've made your point. Give it to me. I will complete the ceremony." Arthur looked down at the hand reaching for the flag, then back up at the young staff sergeant's face. For the first time he spoke. His voice was quiet, rusty from disuse, but it carried across the silent space with absolute clarity. "No, son, you will not." The simple refusal, delivered with such calm finality, was more powerful than any shout. It hung in the air, an unbreakable statement of fact. Evans was stunned into a second of inaction. In that second, another voice, a new voice, boomed from behind him. It was a voice forged in command, a voice that expected and received instant obedience. "Staff Sergeant Evans." Evans flinched and spun around. Standing there, his suit looking suddenly like a uniform, was a tall man with silver hair and eyes that could chip ice. Evans didn't recognize the face, but he recognized the tone. It was the voice of a very senior officer. "Take your hand off that flag," the man said, his voice low and lethal, "and stand back. Now." Evans's training kicked in. He didn't know who this man was, but the authority in his voice was absolute. He instinctively snapped to a position of parade rest, his hands locked behind his back. His face was a whirlwind of confusion and dawning fear. The tall man walked past him and stopped in front of Arthur. The crowd watched, breathless. The two older men looked at each other, and in that shared gaze decades seemed to melt away. The tall man's stern expression softened into something that looked like awe and deep, profound respect. He raised his hand, not to take the flag, but in a slow, perfect salute. "Chief Jenkins," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "it's an honor, sir." The words hit the small gathering like a physical shock wave. "Chief," not "sir," not "Mr." "Chief." Staff Sergeant Evans felt the blood drain from his face. A Chief Master Sergeant, the highest enlisted rank, a living legend in any squadron. He had just given a direct, illegal order to a chief, and not just any chief. The way the tall man had said the name, the way he had saluted, something was happening that was far above his pay grade. The tall man dropped his salute and turned to face Evans, his eyes now hard as steel. "Staff Sergeant, I am General Marcus Miller, and I suggest you listen very carefully. General, 4-star. The name resonated. Miller was the Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force. Evans felt his knees go weak. He had just publicly humiliated himself and his unit in front of one of the most powerful men in the entire military. He could only manage a choked, "Yes, sir." General Miller turned his attention back to Arthur, but he spoke loudly enough for everyone under the canopy to hear. "Some of you may be wondering why I just saluted a retired chief. Enlisted members, even the most senior, are not typically saluted by commissioned officers." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "But Arthur Jenkins is not a typical chief. In fact, there is nothing typical about him at all." Miller looked at the perfectly folded flag in Arthur's hands. "You see, Staff Sergeant, you are trying to follow a manual. I know this because I have read it. What you don't know," he said, turning his piercing gaze back to Evans, "is that you are standing in the presence of the man who wrote that manual." A collective gasp went through the airmen. Airman Garcia stared, his mouth hanging open. The book they had spent hundreds of hours studying, the sacred text of the United States Air Force Honor Guard, was written by the quiet old man they had just disrespected. "Chief Jenkins," Miller continued, his voice resonating with history, "was not just a member of the Honor Guard. He helped create it. He established the standards. He trained the first generation of ceremonial guardsmen who serve at Arlington. The precision you strive for? He invented it. The dignity you are supposed to embody? He defined it." He gestured from the flag to Arthur. "What you just witnessed was not a breach of protocol. It was a master class." But what none of them knew, not the officers, not the bystanders, not even the man recording on his phone, was that in exactly 11 minutes, a black SUV would pull into that parking lot and change every single thing about this moment. The revelation that Arthur had written the book on honor guard ceremonies was stunning enough, but General Miller was not finished. He took a step closer, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more personal, more intense. "But that's not the most important thing you need to know about this man. That's just his day job." He looked over at Sarah Henderson, a look of deep sympathy in his eyes, before turning back to the assembled airmen. 50 years ago, when I was a brand new second lieutenant, my reconnaissance flight was shot down over a piece of contested jungle that doesn't appear on most maps. My pilot was dead. My leg was broken. A patrol was closing in to finish the job. I was 22 years old, and I was about to die. The cemetery was so quiet you could hear the whisper of the flag in the gentle breeze. We had a saying in that unit: "No one left behind," but I was as good as gone. Then, out of the jungle came a para-rescue team. They were outnumbered 10-1. The man leading that team, the man who personally strapped me to his own back and carried me 2 miles through enemy territory while under constant fire, was a young staff sergeant named Arthur Jenkins. Miller pointed a finger, not at Arthur, but at the center of his own chest. "The reason I am standing here today, the reason I have a wife and children, the reason I had a career is because of him. He earned a Silver Star for that action, though he would never tell you that." Miller then looked directly at the flag in Arthur's hands. "But there was something else. One of his team, a young airman, didn't make it out. We held a small service for him right there in a clearing when we reached the extraction point, and Chief Jenkins folded the flag we'd carried, but he did it with a final extra tuck at the end, a small, almost imperceptible fold along the leading edge. It wasn't in any manual. It was a signal, a message just for the men in that unit, a way of saying, 'We will not forget you. You are one of us, forever.'" General Miller's eyes were now glistening. When Chief Jenkins completed his fold here today, he added that same final tuck. He wasn't just folding a flag for his friend, Chief Henderson. He was inducting him into an echelon of heroes that you, Staff Sergeant, cannot possibly comprehend. He was paying him the highest honor he knew how. The full weight of the moment descended upon them. Staff Sergeant Evans was no longer just embarrassed. He was profoundly and utterly humbled. His face, once red with anger, was now pale with shame. He looked at the old man, truly seeing him for the first time. He didn't see a frail, interfering civilian. He saw a giant. He saw a man who had walked through fire, who had written the rules Evans had failed to uphold, and who had just performed a sacred act of remembrance that Evans hadn't even been qualified to witness, let alone interrupt. The other members of the honor guard were equally transfixed. Airman Garcia had tears streaming down his face, unashamed. He was looking at a living piece of Air Force history, a man whose quiet, unassuming presence concealed a legacy of breathtaking courage and unwavering dedication. The older veterans in the crowd, who had been watching with stern disapproval, now stood straighter, their chests puffed out with a shared vicarious pride. One of them, a man with a Marine Corps emblem on his lapel, brought a hand up in a slow, reverent salute, then another and another. Soon every veteran in attendance was saluting Arthur Jenkins. The active duty airmen, following the lead of their elders, also raised their hands in salute. It was a spontaneous, overwhelming wave of respect. Arthur, who had stood stoically through the entire revelation, finally showed a crack in his composure. His chin trembled slightly. He looked from the saluting men to the flag in his hands, and then to Sarah Henderson. He took a slow, deliberate step toward the grieving widow. He knelt before her, his bad knee protesting with a silent groan, and held the flag out to her. "Sarah," he said, his voice thick with a lifetime of unshed tears, "for Robbie. He was a good man." Sarah took the flag, her hands covering his. She wasn't just receiving a symbol of her husband's service. She was receiving a tribute folded by the hands of a legend, a final personal message of honor from her husband's mentor and friend. She pulled him into an embrace, burying her face in his shoulder, and for the first time that day she allowed herself to truly weep. The ceremony concluded in a state of quiet awe. There were no more words spoken. General Miller gently helped Arthur to his feet, and the two men stood side by side as the final prayers were said. The crowd dispersed slowly, respectfully, many of them casting long, wondering looks at the old man in the gray suit. As Sarah Henderson was escorted to her car by her family, she paused and looked back at Arthur. Her hand clutching the flag to her chest, she gave him a small, watery smile of profound gratitude. He simply nodded in return. The honor guard team remained, standing in a loose, shamed formation near the empty casket stand. Staff Sergeant Evans walked over to Arthur and General Miller. He stopped a respectful 3 paces away and came to full, sharp attention. His face was a mess of conflicting emotions. "Chief Jenkins," he began, his voice cracking. "Sir, there are no words. My conduct was inexcusable. I was arrogant, and I was disrespectful. I failed my duty, I failed my team, and I failed Chief Henderson. I am deeply sorry." Arthur looked at the young man. He saw the genuine remorse in his eyes, the crushing weight of his failure. He saw a young leader who had been tested and found wanting, but who was perhaps, in this moment of utter humility, ready to truly learn. You were focused on the procedure, Sergeant, Arthur said, his voice gentle but firm. Not the purpose. Remember the purpose, and the procedure will follow. He offered a small, forgiving nod. You're dismissed. Evans held his salute for a moment longer, his throat working before executing a perfect about-face and marching back to his shaken team. General Miller put a hand on Arthur's shoulder. That was a good thing you did, Artie, he said, using a nickname no one had used in 50 years. Arthur just shook his head, looking out over the endless rows of white stones. I just wanted to make sure Robbie got home right, he whispered. The worst part wasn't the disrespect. The worst part was that he had heard those exact words before, 50 years ago, from a man who was dead 6 hours later. A few weeks passed. The autumn leaves began to turn, painting the trees around the base in shades of gold and crimson. One Tuesday morning, an unusual visitor arrived at the Honor Guard training facility. Arthur Jenkins, dressed not in his worn suit, but in a simple collared shirt and slacks, walked into the cavernous drill hall. He had received a call the week before from a deeply earnest Staff Sergeant Evans, who had formally requested, through the base command structure, if Chief Jenkins would consider observing one of their training sessions. It was a request that had been enthusiastically and immediately approved by General Miller himself. As Arthur entered, the entire Honor Guard contingent, 2 full teams, snapped to attention. The sound of 20 pairs of boots hitting the polished concrete floor in unison echoed through the hall. Evans stood before them, his posture perfect. "Honor Guard, attention," he barked. "Welcome, Chief Jenkins." Arthur walked slowly down the line of young airmen, looking each one in the eye. He saw nerves, yes, but he also saw eagerness. He saw a newfound sobriety, a deep burning desire to get it right. He stopped in front of Airman Garcia. The young man's face was resolute. "We're honored to have you here, Chief," Garcia said, his voice steady. Arthur nodded. "The honor is in the work, Airman. Show me what you've got." For the next 2 hours Arthur watched. He said nothing. He simply observed as they practiced every aspect of the funeral ceremony, the rifle volleys, the carrying of the casket, and of course the flag fold. They were better, much better. The weeks of shame had been a powerful motivator. Their movements were sharper, more synchronized. But something was still missing, the soul, the purpose. Finally he called a halt. "You've mastered the steps," he said, his voice filling the quiet hall. "Now you need to understand the rhythm. The flag is not a piece of cloth. It's a life. It's the story of a nation. You have to feel its weight, not just in your hands, but in here." He tapped his chest. He then picked up a flag himself. "Let's begin again," he said, "from the top. This time with purpose." The closing sequence of the day was the most telling. Arthur worked with Evans and Garcia specifically on the 2-man fold. He didn't just correct their hand positions. He talked to them. He told them stories. He told them about the first time he'd seen a flag presented to a Gold Star mother. He told them about the feeling of folding the flag for a friend lost in a training accident. He wasn't teaching them a drill. He was passing on a legacy. He showed them how to let the flag tell them how it wanted to be folded, how to listen to the fabric. He taught them that the crisp snap of the cloth wasn't for show. It was an exclamation point, a declaration of honor. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the drill floor, they performed one final fold. Evans and Garcia moved as one, their hands a mirror image of each other. The flag yielded to them, the folds sharp, the triangle perfect. When they were done, Evans held the finished flag in his hands, looking down at it with a reverence that hadn't been there before. He looked up at Arthur, his eyes shining with gratitude and a hard-won understanding. "Thank you, Chief," he said, his voice full of emotion. "Thank you." The story of what happened at Chief Henderson's funeral spread, as such stories do, through the quiet, unofficial channels of the military. It became a piece of institutional lore, a lesson passed from senior NCOs to young airmen about how heroes walk among us, often unseen. The Base Honor Guard became the pride of the command, known not just for their technical perfection, but for the profound sense of dignity they brought to every ceremony. Staff Sergeant Evans went on to become one of an elite few chosen to train other Honor Guard units across the country, always starting his first lesson with the story of the old man who taught him the difference between procedure and purpose. The injustice faced by Arthur Jenkins was transformed into a powerful lesson on respect, reminding us that true honor isn't found in a uniform or a title, but in a lifetime of quiet service. The day ended not with a dramatic flourish, but with a quiet moment of connection that changed a young sergeant's career and reaffirmed the enduring legacy of a hidden hero. The story of that day reminds us all that we should never judge a person by their appearance, because beneath a quiet exterior may lie a history of incredible courage and sacrifice. For more stories that celebrate our nation's heroes, please subscribe to our channel.